Hey, Holly.
Hey, Dave.
What is happening today on the What Difference Does It Make podcast?
Oh, Dave, I am desperate to get to this interview.
Oh, yeah? Why might that be?
I am desperately seeking this interview with Susan Seidelman, who has a memoir, Desperately Seeking Something, a memoir about movies, mothers, and material girls. How do we know Susan Seidelman?
Oh, she's directed a number of films that you might know. Have you heard of Desperately Seeking Susan?
Oh, I think I vaguely remember this film.
Okay. You ever watch Sex and the City?
She directed 4 episodes from the first season of Sex and the City and didn't even know how big it was going to be.
You ever work with Meryl Streep?
I have not.
Okay. And you know anyone who has?
Susan Seidelman?
Yes. Also, one of my favorite indie films is Smithereens. It's a look at this kind of what New York was like in the early 80s. It's a nice time capsule and a great film and a great intro into what Susan Seidelman's work is like throughout her whole career. And this book was really wonderful. You really loved this, didn't you?
I love this book so much. She told the story in such a fabulous, relatable way, just like we talked about with her, how New York plays a character in her stories. New York definitely plays a character in her book. I loved reading about New York and I loved reading about her.
Well, okay, so we're going to learn all about how fabulous Susan is, hopefully. She's as fabulous as the book, as you say this book is.
Oh, she's fabulous, all right.
Okay, well, you think so. Okay, well, we'll find out for sure. And another way to find out is on social media. Where might we find some Susan Seidelman clips?
There will be outtakes with Susan Seidelman on our YouTube channel at What Difference Does It Make Podcast and all our other social media at WDDIM Podcast.
You can also subscribe to our podcast. You click that subscribe button. You'll like our podcast. If this is your first time because you love Susan Seidelman, thank you for joining us. Subscribe and get our newsletter at WDDIMpodcast.com, which stands for What Difference Does It Make Podcast.com. Let's get into it. This is director Susan Seidelman talking about her book, her memoir, Desperately Seeking Something, a memoir about movies, mothers, and material girls on the What Difference Does It Make podcast.
Hello.
Hi, Susan. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah. I saw that this is an 80s music, but is it also film and music or mostly music? Or?
So the podcast is What Difference Does It Make? What difference does it make? If it interests us, we're all in, right? Like a project like you might get involved in.
It's generally 80s music and pop culture.
Which I guess should lead us to the first question in your book, Desperately Seeking Something, because we're an 80s music podcast. All the chapters are music-based. How did you come upon that idea?
Well, music is really important in my life and also in my films. Because I always think music kind of takes you somewhere. It's like an instant emotion. You hear a song and your head goes to maybe where you were when you first heard it. So in a way, it just felt right to kind of break it up with song titles rather than chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3.
And how'd you do the research for that? Like a theme?
I wrote the book without the song titles, but then I started to think about what each chapter was about. And sometimes a song immediately popped into my head. I mean, some obvious ones like Girls Just Want to Have Fun or Wake Up Little Susie, to put in a chapter where I was kind of figuring out who I was and needed to be woken up. And then sometimes I did some research, just kind of thinking, plugged in like a word or something, and then sort of saw which of those songs resonated with me. But for the most part, a lot of them were just songs I remembered from my life and that had some significance and I hoped made some sort of sense, leading the reader into that chapter of the book.
Okay, and speaking of the music being really important in all your films, so you know what songs you wanted to use in your films?
No, I didn't always know what songs I wanted to use. I worked with some good music supervisors, and sometimes I did have a kind of song. Like I grew up when I was a kid, it was in the 60s when I was in high school. And so I kind of loved all those 60s girl group songs and all the kind of British pop songs from that Carnaby Street era. As I got older, I then kind of liked all the new wave British songs from the 80s. But growing up, those 60s girl group songs really spoke to me. And I wasn't sure why at the time, but now I kind of realized that they were telling female stories and they were telling stories that I related to at that time. And also, some of the groups, they were kind of cool, like the Shangri-Las, as some of those other 60s girl groups. So they were inspirational in the way that they could show me how, different ways a person could lead their lives.
Yeah, it's funny that you chose the Shangri-Las as your first choice because that's just the melodramatic movie title, the music that just kind of tells a story. It's just over the top, just girls looking for adventure.
Absolutely, which is what I was. I had wanted to make a movie originally. It was right after I did Smithereens, my first film. Before Desperately Seeking Susan, I had gone out to LA and taken a lot of meetings with the intention of wanting to make a movie about, it wasn't specifically the Shangri-Las, but it was sort of a tough girl group from Queens. And I actually met with a guy named Shadow Morton, who was the guy whose idea it was to put all those sound effects in, like a leader of the pack and the vroom vroom of the engines and the car crashes and all that. And maybe the appeal was partly because they were so cinematic, those songs.
I love so much your descriptions of New York are so vivid. As I was reading the book, I was sending, my daughter lives in New York. I was sending her your descriptions of it back then. And, she was saying, I know where that is. I know where that is. And it was a lot of fun. And she was telling me what's there now.
Yeah, it's a very different city now. Yeah. I mean, when I moved to New York, originally I was from Philadelphia and kind of grew up in, the suburbs of Philadelphia. And New York was like this dream 2 hours away, but it felt like another planet to me. And I couldn't wait to move there. And I think NYU Film School gave me a reason to get there. But it was also the mid 70s. New York was still in a bankruptcy crisis. So the city was definitely falling apart. But that for a young person without a lot of money and made it affordable to live in, and also made it kind of like a playground, like a funky, messy playground, because a lot of other people from all around the world and all around the country were also going to New York for those same reasons, to figure out who they were or to discover who they wanted to be.
Well, that kind of leads us into Smithereens, doesn't it? Because it's just a nice snapshot of what the city looked like back then. It's kind of thrilling to watch it and revisit and like, oh, wow, this was what New York City was like, as you allude to. Ren and her, I don't know, boyfriend, her friend, the nice guy who lives in the van. Yeah, that's the High Line now. What you're showing is not the High Line at all.
Yeah. I think actually part of what it is now is, what is that? There's a whole new area that just sort of popped up. It's like an entire instant neighborhood that popped up in New York. In that area, Hudson Yards is what it's called, which didn't exist 3 years ago and now does. But that's, I guess, what's kind of interesting about New York is that it keeps reinventing itself. You go away for a couple of years and you come back and it's something different.
Yeah, and that's, it's kind of what the character of Ren was trying to reinvent herself or just find herself, I guess. And, reading your book, it sounds like, well, Ren and Susan are pretty much very similar.
She was a bit more self-destructive than I was, but certainly we came to New York for the same reasons, this kind of feeling that there was another way to live and a more creative and interesting way to live. And I wanted to be a part of it, And I think that was what New York City and certainly downtown New York was like at that time. It's funny because we were talking about music, and music really is a driving force in that film as well. The Feelies, who did the soundtrack for the movie, their music has this kind of crazy, nervous energy to it, which really captured the spirit of the character of Ren.
Let me ask about the Feelies then. How did you come across the Feelies? You're just young, like, I will ask Richard Hell to be in my movie. I will get the Feelies. How'd this happen?
Yeah. I felt it living in, the Lower East Side, that there was a kind of, that people in various art forms, whether it was music or filmmaking or graffiti art or whatever it is, there was a lot of cross-pollinating. And I think I had heard about Richard Hell and I'd been to see the GBs and thought he had a great persona. And I thought if I can capture that in my film, that would make for a really interesting leading male character. And then once you get to know somebody, he said, do you want to use some of my music? And of course I said, yes. But actually the Feelies were introduced to me by the film director, Jonathan Demme, who was really wonderful and a great guy who helped out a lot of filmmakers when they were starting out. And he was a great music lover.
Was he was he at NYU? Was he a professor there or was he a student? Or what? No, how'd you get a hold of Jonathan?
He was a New York film, because back then still so much of the industry was based in LA still. But suddenly there were a couple of directors like Scorsese, Jonathan Demme and Woody Allen who were working out of New York. And Jonathan Demme, sort of a friend of mine named Ron Neisweiner, who actually co-wrote Smithereens with me, had sent Jonathan Demme a script. Jonathan liked it. They met. Ron Neisweiner introduced me to Demme. And as I said, he always was very helpful to up-and-coming filmmakers. So he gave me a list of some people who he thought might be interesting. He watched the film with me and then suggested some people. And the first one actually was John Cale from the Velvet Underground. We met and it was kind of a funky time in Cale's life, I think. And I knew
funky.
It was
okay. We know what you mean by funky. I understand.
We all have those funky times.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yeah. Okay.
He was interesting, but I just thought this was not going to be a good working relationship. And then he suggested the Feelies, and I guess their manager sent me a demo for their first album. I don't even know if it had come out yet. And I listened to their music and it had such a great energetic, but also kind of nervous pulse to it that it just felt like the musical version of the character of Ren. And usually when you work on a movie, and certainly on my later movies, you edit the movie first, then you bring in a composer and a music supervisor to then help you put in the score or the songs. But in this case, when I heard their music, I actually recut the film to fit their pre-existing music rather than the other way around.
It's amazing. Like a happy accident. And I have to ask you about this other happy accident. I mean, it wasn't a happy accident. Richard Hell was not the original actor. Can you tell the story of how Richard Hell kind of came into the picture?
Yeah. Well, originally there was another actor. I think he was French or Swiss. He had a French accent, who was cast to play the role that Richard Hell then plays. And he was more of an artist because at the time, the art scene was really exciting too. He wasn't a rocker. He was an artist, a painter. I started filming with him and we were on the 5th day of filming and we were doing a rehearsal in the loft that was supposed to be his loft in the film. He and the main character, Ren, have an argument and he lifts Ren up and puts her out in his fire escape and shuts the window to get her out of his loft. Susan Berman, the actress who plays Ren, saw there was an open window at the other end of the fire escape and ran across the fire escape to climb back in. Didn't realize that the fire escape ended and just fell off the fire escape. I was inside watching this rehearsal. I was doing a rehearsal. Watching, and it was like a Roadrunner cartoon. I saw her running along and then just dropping off the edge of a cliff. I didn't know how far she had dropped, or kind of horrifying in a surreal way. Fortunately, she landed on the fire escape 20 feet below and broke her leg pretty bad in a couple of places, but survived. And she was in a cast for the next 4 months. And during that time, what was great, well, actually what could have been a disaster that I turned into something great, was that I had a chance to edit the scenes that we had shot, see what was working, see what wasn't working, realize that the character of Ren probably would be more attractive to a rock and roll guy, not a painter. And so recast that role with Richard Hell, and very happy that I did.
But budget-wise, I mean, just to think like, all right, this 5 days of filming, we're just throwing that away. I mean, that must have been painful for a film student.
Yeah, because the film was done on such a low budget. It was a little painful. But what I saw was that the scenes where Susan Berman was acting alone were great. And there just wasn't, the other actor who played the original actor was good. There just wasn't chemistry between them. So I think if Susan had not had that accident, I really don't think the film would have had the success it then went on to have. But of course, I didn't know any of that at the time.
Had you spoken to her about it afterwards, after the film, won its accolades?
She was thrilled because her leg did heal, and she liked the script changes that were made during that period. And yeah, we talked about it a lot. We both ended up at the Cannes Film Festival together when the film premiered there, and laughed about how probably had she not broken her leg, we wouldn't be in Cannes at this moment.
I'm also curious about the sunglasses that start the film. Without those sunglasses, you don't have a film.
Yeah. Well, fashion has always been really important to me because I think you can say things with fashion and with props. It's like visual storytelling. You see those sunglasses and you get an impression about the person who might wear them. And the opening of Smithereens is a close-up of those sunglasses in somebody's hand on a subway platform. And then you see the character of Wren walk into frame. You don't see her. You see her vinyl black and white check miniskirt that matches the pattern on the sunglasses. And instantly, without any dialogue needed, she's going to snatch those glasses and run. You just know it. So it was a way of visually telling that story economically. I think there used to be a store and it was run by, I think we found those. I worked with a costume designer named Allison Lancis on that movie. We went to Patricia Fields had a funky clothing store on 8th Street. It was one of the first sort of punk clothing stores in the East Village. And I think we bought them there. And of course, Pat Fields went on to do Sex and the City and a lot of other things. But in her early days, the reason I remember her was because of her clothing store on 8th Street.
So when you went to Cannes, was that the time where your parents were like, okay, I guess Susan's going to be okay?
I think they were still in shock. I think I was still adjusting to the fact that I was there. I mean, the whole thing was surreal. I was there with Susan Berman and a few other crew members came to the festival to join us. And we were so scrappy is the only word I can think of. Everyone else, it was so glamorous and it was so over the top and surreal that we were so kind of scrappy by comparison that it all felt a little surreal. One of the moments was when the night of the screening, Susan and I were asked to walk the red carpet and stand in front of at the top of the stairs at the Palais, which was the name of the theater where the film was shown. And we just looked around at the paparazzi and it was like we were kicking each other, not literally, but mentally, like, what are we doing here? This is so weird. And I think, my parents showed up because I don't think they kind of realized that this was the start of my grown-up career. And I'm not sure if I realized it at that time as well. It still took a little while to kind of, if someone asked me what I was, to say film director. I don't think I had the confidence to do that yet, but that was certainly a major turning point for me.
Talking with Susan Seidelman, the author of Desperately Seeking Something. We are desperately seeking a break, so we're going to do that right now.
Back on the What Difference Does It Make podcast with our guest, Susan Seidelman. I can't remember exactly where it ends, where you feel comfortable now calling yourself a film director.
Desperately Seeking Susan. After that, I did feel comfortable.
Did your parents reach that point at the same time?
I hoped it would be successful, but it made a bigger splash commercially and critically than anyone who worked on it would have thought. It was made by a Hollywood studio called Orion at the time, but it was still a low-budget Hollywood movie. It was made for under $5 million. We had one of the senior executives named Barbara Boyle really pushed for the movie to get made. But I think the studio felt, well, it's $5 million. If it flops, we'll make some TV sales or whatever. It's not going to be too great a loss. So no one was really prepared for what would happen during the filming of that movie and the effect that that would have on the box office and also on the culture in a way. It was
Yeah.
surprising.
So Madonna's star was on the rise during the filming.
Not when we started, though.
Yeah.
Not when we started. I knew Madonna because she lived 3 blocks away from me in New York. She lived in Soho. And because of Smithereens, I had friends that were part of like the downtown music scene, the downtown club scene. So I had heard her name bantied around, and I knew she had a song that was playing on MTV. And this was the early days of MTV. I think the song was Borderline, but it was getting some play, but she wasn't a big act yet by any means. In fact, when I suggested her to the head of Orion, Mike Medavoy, and Barbara Boyle, they didn't know who she was and asked that she come out to meet them and do a screen test. And I tell the story in the book that fortunately Barbara Boyle had a 15-year-old son who thought Madonna was cute or sexy and had, been a fan of Borderline or Holiday or one of her early songs, and kind of pushed his mother into wanting to meet Madonna. But, maybe had it not been for that 15-year-old kid, or had things gone differently, who knows how the movie would have turned out. But again, just like with Smithereens, I knew Richard Hell was right for that role once I met him. And, my goal in Smithereens was to get his persona into the character on film. And I felt the same way with Madonna. I thought she knew how to flirt with the camera. I knew the camera liked her. I knew she was a dancer and could move. And that's really important.
We recently had Alan Hunter on our podcast, and he was talking about his first interview with Madonna in '84. And so we went back and watched it, and she's talking about Desperately Seeking Susan like it's a romantic comedy. She's going to be playing like a Judy Holliday, Carol Lombard type role. Yeah. Is that the way you were instructing her to? Like, this is a romantic, this is like, think of screwball comedies or, kind of like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Desperately Seeking Susan is kind of new twisted take on an old screwball comedy. It uses, and intentionally so, it uses devices from screwball comedies of the 30s and early 40s, like mistaken identities, like amnesia, and it uses them on purpose. I'm kind of doing it with a bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because I know that they're devices, but I thought that they were great devices to use for a movie with the theme of transformation, somebody who wants to reinvent themselves and be somebody else. What better way than to conk your head, get amnesia, and then become the person you really want to be?
Actually, in this interview, she was also talking about that, like, acting is harder. You're going to have to learn how to lose your inhibitions. And she kind of alludes that made her a better performer, is acting and losing yourself, like who you are, and becoming someone new.
Absolutely. And I think, we had a lot of conversations and talked about what movies she should watch before we started filming. But that's not to say it was easy. Madonna was just being Madonna. She wasn't.
Right.
She was giving that persona to the character of Susan, but she was saying totally scripted lines. She was finding that little X, her mark on the floor, where she had to stand and move and the camera had to be choreographed. There's a lot of technical and acting stuff involved. It wasn't just sort of, hey, Madonna, just be Madonna and we'll turn the camera on. I mean, the one thing I realized about her is that she's an incredibly disciplined person. Maybe some of that comes from her dance background or her just sort of professional focus, determination, drive. She's very structured in a way and disciplined about how she lives her life.
And you showed some of the marketing materials. By the time the film was released, Madonna was becoming Madonna, and there were some of the marketing materials that only featured her.
Yeah, well, what happened is, so when we first started the film, and the first day of shooting was actually the shot where she's walking down the street wearing those little white gloves and eating cheese puffs. That was filmed on St. Mark's Place. There was camera trucks and a crew and lights and stuff like that. But pedestrians were not paying much attention. We weren't creating much of a buzz, and people would look, oh, there's a camera, there's a film crew. no stars that they recognized at that time. But by 9 weeks later, by the time we finished filming, her Like a Virgin album was either just released or about to be released, but she had done the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. And it was like watching a meteor explode. Everything had changed so dramatically over those 9 months, so that by the end we did need security guards. And the movie that had started out originally, the first person cast was Rosanna Arquette as the young upcoming star, suddenly began being referred to as the Madonna movie. And that was just because suddenly she had this huge album and this movie was coming out, and they both fed off each other.
I'm curious, as the director, how did you handle it in the end with Madonna and Rosanna Arquette, who was the actor, especially with the materials that are featuring Madonna so heavily?
Yeah, I think it was a little hard between me and Rosanna, because I think I probably was not as sensitive as I would be now. I mean, I was young. I was probably naive about how to work with actresses and how they feel and the whole process. And I think it must have been hard to come on as the star of the film. I mean, it was a movie that starred two women, but she was the known Hollywood up and coming starlet. And then suddenly find yourself in a movie that's being called the Madonna movie. And I probably could have handled that with a little more sensitivity, something I realized as I got older and got to work with more and just had more experience working with actors.
Have you talked about it since the movie was shot?
Yeah, I did. And I was glad I did, because after the movie, our lives intersected. Like, we were both at Madonna's wedding together and we did some press things together. But it really wasn't until we had the 25th anniversary screening at Lincoln Center of the movie, and she was there. And, you know, we were both now older, hopefully more mature. And I watched it and I saw just how brilliant she was in it. Not that Madonna isn't brilliant in her way, but I saw that Rosanna just gives that character, makes her so quirky and so vulnerable, and has so many just wonderful little facial movements and reactions, and just makes that character come alive in ways that got overshadowed by just the sheer pizzazz of Madonna's career at that time. But it was clear that as years have passed, that Rosanna has gotten the recognition for the movie that she so deserves.
I wanted to ask about just the opening shots again for all of those. I mean, you mentioned Madonna with the cheese puffs and Ren running down the streets with sunglasses. I kept thinking of Saturday Night Fever with Tony Manero walking down the street. Is that, like, as a student of film, is that something you were looking for, or just putting New York as part of the co-star in the film?
New York is always the co-star in several of the things I've made. But I do think about opening shots and closing shots. I mean, it's like when somebody walks into a room, if you're in a party and you first notice them, you instantly get an impression about that person. Maybe it's because of what they wear or how their hair is or the sound of their voice or whatever. So first impressions are really important. And then you go from there as you get to know them. You may realize your first impression was totally wrong, But I feel that way about the opening shot or opening scene of a movie, that it's like saying, here's my movie. And, I'm introducing you to it. I'm inviting you to see what this might be. And so I do spend a lot of time thinking about what the opening is going to be like. And in the case of Desperately Seeking Susan, I knew, along with two of my really important collaborators, which was the DP, Ed Lockman, and the production designer, Santo Laquasto, I knew we wanted to create two different worlds. And in the opening of the movie, we were going to set up who these characters were. We were going to set up the kind of feminine, pastel, neutral kind of world that the Rosanna Arquette, the kind of bored housewife, lives in. So we set the opening scene in a hair salon where everyone's in kind of peach-colored smocks. And then when we introduced Madonna a few minutes later, she's in a kind of garish hotel room on the floor wearing black fishnets with a pyramid jacket and taking a selfie. So instantly you're setting up the difference between these two main characters, and the difference between the worlds that they live in.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of just the opening of your book. You could tell us who Rita Mae Brown is. The reward for conformity is that everyone likes you but yourself.
Yeah.
That seems to be the theme of your entire life. Like, okay, I'm going to take the path less traveled.
I love that quote because it kind of does say it all, but also because I came out of the world I grew up in, certainly when I was a kid, was that kind of world of little boxes. I grew up in a 60s suburban development where all the people kind of looked the same, all the houses. Well, there were 3 styles of houses you could choose from. So you lived in one of those 3 styles, and it was safe. It was like a safe little protective bubble, but there was not a lot of room to be different. There wasn't a lot of room to be different. And if you felt, in some ways I always looked like I fit in, but there was a part of me inside that knew, I didn't feel like a freak, but I just felt inside was somewhat different than the outside. And that theme has played out in so many of the films that I've made, that idea of wanting to be your authentic self, that idea of reinvention, and the idea of the desire to be brave enough to reinvent yourself.
Just so I know, just Rita Mae Brown, who is she and where'd you find the quote?
She's an author, and she wrote a book called Ruby Fruit Jungle that I remember reading when I guess I read it when I was in college. I haven't read it in maybe 40 years. I don't know if it was exactly a coming out story. At that time, especially when she wrote the book, which I guess was in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of lesbian literature that was embraced by the mainstream. And her book was one of the first, at least the first that I had read.
Did you end up at Drexel because it was close to home? It was just an obvious choice?
I ended up at Drexel. At that time, it was now it's Drexel University. At that time, it was Drexel Institute of Technology. But at that time, it had a fashion program. And for me, in high school, the one way I was able to rebel was through fashion. I dressed differently than a lot of my friends. And it was my way of expressing myself. And I guess maybe coming from a traditional background where women were in this, there were good girls and bad girls. It gave me, in some ways, being brought up to be a good girl, a way to express my bad girlness. And it was a way to also express my artistic side. Interestingly enough, it was still in a girly way. Certainly I loved movies, but I never thought about being a film director. I just didn't know of any women film directors, certainly not American ones, except for Elaine May, the only one I had ever heard of growing up. So that wasn't like a career path I even thought about following when I decided to go to college. But fashion was, and it was through fashion and realizing that you could make the fashions move. You can allow the fashion to tell stories. You could put fashion to music, that led sort of organically to wanting to make movies.
Speaking of good girls and bad girls, Sex and the City. I think you mentioned in the book that you didn't know what it was going to be. I guess, how could you? Like with Desperately Seeking Susan, you don't know what it's going to become. How did that come to you? How did you end up directing? You directed the first 4, right?
No, I directed the pilot and then I directed 2 of the other episodes, but all in season 1. And what was interesting about season 1, which I think is the grittier season, the grittiest season of Sex and the City, was that the majority of the directors were female. There were 3 of us. There was Nicole Holofcener, a woman named Allison Clean, and myself. What happened was, I guess it was my agent. I don't remember who it was exactly, but somebody sent me this script. And I had heard of Darren Star. I knew he had done Melrose Place and worked on Beverly Hills, but I didn't really watch those films at this point. I don't know if I was in my early 40s or whatever, but those weren't the TV shows I was watching, but I knew that they were popular, so I had heard of him. And when I got the script to direct a TV pilot, I wasn't super excited because I really liked making movies at that time. But I read the script and I was blown away. It was quite simply that. I read the script. I thought it was so smart, so funny, so different than the way I had seen female characters portrayed in TV shows before, that I said I just knew I wanted to do it. Had no idea it would be a success, but just that the story was compelling and the writing was good and the characters were bold. A phone call was set up, and it was pretty quick phone call. We chatted. I think he had been a fan of Desperately Seeking Susan. I told him I liked the script. He said, "You want to direct it?" I said, "Yes." Mm-hmm. And that's how it happened. And making that was an incredible experience, because my goal, I told him this right from the start, was to try to make it like a film. So he was on the same page. And fortunately, we hired a movie DP, a guy named Stuart Dryberg, who had done the movie The Piano, which was an amazing movie directed by Jane Campion, who wasn't a TV director. The production designer was also a movie guy who had worked with Mira Nair on some of her films. The sense that I had was I was making a movie, it was just shorter.
And one of the actors from Smithereens, Chris Noth, was in Sex and the City. Was that just a happy accident, or how'd that happen?
Well, I had bumped into him once or twice in New York, but in Smithereens, Chris Noth has a cameo as a hooker in a dress. It was fun because I remember when I was given the script, some of the women had already been cast. Sarah Jessica Parker was involved early on. Kristen Davis, Darren knew her from Melrose Place. And Kim Cattrall, actually, I had auditioned her years before for Desperately Seeking Susan. Darren had already cast her. So the two uncast roles, major roles, were Miranda and Mr. Big. And so I was involved in the casting conversations for those. And of course, in the script, I remember it described Mr. Big as an Alec Baldwin lookalike or something like that, or an Alec Baldwin type at that time. And I remember Chris came in to audition. We chatted because we knew each other. And I was glad that ultimately he felt right for that role.
You had mentioned that you were proud that a number of women directors on Sex and the City, after Desperately Seeking Susan, you have your own like Madonna moments and you get to choose whatever film you want. Did you want to hire more women? Was there like, did you have an objective? Like, I want, on my next film, this is who I want. I want to give opportunities to other people.
I have always tried to give opportunities to other women because I think women do work really hard and maybe even harder than some, because they need to prove themselves. I know I have had to work harder than some of my male compatriots just to get over that hump, Yeah, so I have always tried to work with women when I can, but I also want to work with good people. So I want to work with good women.
Yeah.
But also I wanted to always make movies about women, only because I think I have a take on that. Maybe some male directors don't. I mean, there's no way, there's certain scripts I'll read that I'll think, well, this is a great script, but I think Scorsese's going to do it better than me. Or somebody, some other director will be able to bring their thing to it. So I tried to choose projects with characters where I thought I could put my spin or my vision into the film in a way that somebody else might not be able to do.
Also, the characters, and this is probably obvious for someone who's a filmmaker, but for me, it was just an outsider's observation. Your characters in each film kind of age along with us. Is it a conscious decision because this is what you know?
I think that's true. I think because in some ways my films are personal, even though I'm not always the writer. I am the person that works with the writer and tweaks and tries to overlay my stuff into the film. But I think that that's true, that as I've gotten older, the themes have changed. The characters have gotten a bit older because I am relating to it all in a very personal way. But that doesn't mean that everything has, I have also worked with younger characters as, when I've gotten older. I mean, I like when films feel personal, not just my films. I like when other directors make personal films. I mean, that's what I like about Tarantino. I feel Tarantino in his movies and some of the other directors that I've loved. So yeah, maybe it's narcissism. I don't know. Probably a bit of that, but also a bit of,
you write what
that's
you know.
what interests me at the moment.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and it is what you know. It's your experience. But also, I just watched this film, Boynton Beach Club. I love this film so much, and I love the story. about your mom, how this came together with your mom and your mom's
Yeah.
participation in it. Can you talk a little bit about this? And your mom is such a fascinating character in your
Yeah.
memoir, but how this film came to be.
Well, that's a film I could have made now that I'm the age of those characters. But back then, it was my mom's film. My mother's always been an influence on me because she always encouraged me to not be afraid to fail. Maybe that's the best way to put it. To go for something. And if you don't succeed, or if it flops, or if it's a disaster, just pick yourself up and try again. And I've had failures, but fortunately, because of my mom's advice or encouragement, I never let them kind of destroy me. Over the years, my mother had been cutting out articles from newspapers and sending them to me in the mail. This is pre-internet, right? With little sticky notes saying, "Don't you think this would make a good movie?" And sometimes I did, but I didn't think that I would be the best director for that story. And sometimes I didn't think it would make a good movie, again, for me, or that didn't interest me. But one day she called me up with this story idea because a friend of hers had passed away, and her friend's husband had gone to a bereavement club. I guess he was in his late 60s, early 70s at this time. And suddenly he found himself being hit on by all these women at the bereavement club, because there were 20 women and 3 men. And little by little, he found himself back in the dating game again at a time when he realized that all the rules had changed. He hadn't been on a date in maybe 30, 40 years, and suddenly he enters this whole new world. So my mother started to tell me about some of his experiences. And as she's talking to me, I thought, well, that would be cool to make a romantic comedy about older people that was about love, companionship, and also about sex. And I also realized that there were a lot of great older actors that weren't getting movie roles anymore, or maybe they were playing, the lead character's grandmother sitting on a porch in a rocking chair or something. But this would be a great opportunity to have these actors who were romantic comedy stars in their day play leading characters in a romantic comedy. So anyway, so she told me this idea, and I was about to leave to go to Canada to make a movie for Showtime. And even though I thought the idea was great, I just didn't have time to think about it. So I said to my mom, "Look, if you like the idea, why don't you write the screenplay?" And my mom said, "I don't know how to write a screenplay." And I said, "Go to Barnes and Noble and buy a screenplay for dummies book and read it and give it a shot." So I went off to make a movie in Canada. I came back 2.5 months later, and there in my mailbox was this thick manila envelope with my mom's screenplay in it. And that's exactly what she had done. I read it, and what I realized is that the story structure was a mess. There was a lot of messy, amateurish things about it, but it had so many brilliant moments that I wouldn't have known about, not having gone through that experience and not being that age, that I said, "This is great. I can see this movie. Do you mind if I take it and work with a writing partner named Shelley Gitlow at that time? And if we can just kind of brush it up and restructure it using and trying to keep all those wonderfully authentic moments." And she said, "Sure." And that's what led to Boynton Beach Club.
That's insane.
I love this film so much, and the cast you have with Sally Kellerman and Joseph Bologna and Brenda Vaccaro.
Brenda Vaccaro. Yeah, they were all like major stars in their time. And it was wonderful to get to work with all of them. Michael Nouri was in it. He had been in Flashdance in the early 80s. And the film is set in one of those gated communities, 50 plus adult only communities in Florida. And so it was kind of a wonderful, colorful setting. All those communities have these fantasy names like Valencia Isles and Palm Breeze and, these kind of magical fairy tale names. So it seemed like the perfect setting to do this kind of romantic comedy.
Yeah, I guess. And your mom's been in this for your entire career. She was in Act Like One too, right? Your first film, your first student film.
She had a background action
Right.
kind of role, but she was in there. Yes, she was in there.
I got the criterion. So I saw like your brother's in that film and, you know, and your house. So it's like, this was the start of your memoir. So now usually it's the pandemic now. Everyone says it's the pandemic that began the process for your memoir. What's the start for you?
Absolutely, it was the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, suddenly the whole world was on lockdown and everyone had a lot of time to think about things and they weren't going out. So they were thinking. So I just started to take notes and I didn't know it was going to be a memoir. I just started taking notes on my cell phone and just memories. There were two other things that happened that I think also motivated me to turn this into a memoir. One was that the second week of the pandemic, an actor friend of mine, Mark Blum, who plays Rosanna Arquette's husband, the spa salesman, the spa king in Desperately Seeking Susan, he passed away from COVID. He was one of the early kind of actor celebrity victims of COVID. It makes you think about your own mortality, that there's something going on right now and people are dying and life is so uncertain. So that motivated me. And also when the pandemic started, I was probably, I don't know if I was 68 or 69, but I was on the verge of turning 70. And I read this great quote by Leonard Cohen, the musician, who said that 70 isn't old, but it's the foothills of old age. And it kind of is. I mean, I don't feel old. I don't feel, I certainly don't feel or look like what I thought a 70-year-old person when I was a kid looked or sounded like. But that 6 did change to a 7. And that 7 is a wake-up call. It makes you just realize that you're in your third act. And it is a time for reflection. I mean, to me, it's always funny because I've seen and I've read some memoirs written by people who are 30. And I'm thinking, you're 30, you're writing a memoir. What are you writing about? High school? Mm-hmm. I think you kind of have to live enough life and have enough perspective on the life you've led. At least I needed to have that to be able to talk about it with some distance and some objectivity. So pandemic, my age, thinking about life in general, motivated me to want to write this. And another thing, also thinking about how there really weren't that many books about what it was like to be a woman director. I mean, I certainly had never read one when I first started out on this journey. I would have loved to have read somebody's memoir saying, these are some of the things, the obstacles that might be in your path, and these are some ways you might want to negotiate around some of the problems you might encounter. So in part, I was also writing, it's not exactly a guidebook, but a little bit of a book to pass on some life lessons to the next generation of young women out there who are making movies.
Well, thank you so much, Susan. This was really wonderful. I really appreciate the time you spent with us. The book, Desperately Seeking Something, a memoir about movies, mothers, and material girls. Yeah, we really enjoyed ourselves. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Did Susan Seidelman live up to your expectations?
All that and more. I wish I could now sit down with her and have a nice long dinner over a glass of wine and hear more of her stories, her experiences. I feel like I want more. So maybe she'll come back sometime and talk about another project she's working on.
Okay, that's possible. Yeah, I know you read the book and you want to talk about each and every chapter. So
I do.
She didn't choose the easy life, though.
The path of least resistance.
Yes, exactly.
She definitely did not, but she's a trailblazer. She's definitely a role model.
You want to do something, you go out and get it. Be a Susan Seidelman.
Be Susan Seidelman. That should be our motto.
All right. What would Susan Seidelman do if she had a social media?
She very well may, but on our social media, you will find outtakes from this chat with Susan on YouTube at What Difference Does It Make Podcast and on our social media at WDVIM Podcast. So check it out.
All right. And also, if this is your first time, again, a reminder to please subscribe so you get every episode. We have new episodes every Friday. You can subscribe to our newsletter. That would be WDDIM Podcast, which stands for What Difference Does It Make? Podcast.com. Send out a newsletter once a month. It's nice. Podcasts every Friday. So that's nice as well. Everything is nice. You think so?
I think it is. It is a nice day, isn't it?
We're trying to be nice here. We don't want to pound this down, but it's just something you got to do.
We don't have to try to be nice, do we? Can we just be nice?
Well, okay. Well, we will nicely say subscribe, and thank you.
Thank you to John Carl at St. Martin's Press.
Very good. Thank you to Pantheon Podcast. We are a proud Pantheon Podcast member. And thank you to you, Holly.
And thank you, Dave.
All right. Well, this wraps up yet another episode. Until next time, this is Dave.
This is Holly.
Check you later.
Over and out.
Waterproof records are your unsinkable tunes from the past, present, and future. What's up, everyone? I'm Jacob Givens, the host of Waterproof Records podcast. So what exactly is a waterproof record? Let's go back in time for a moment to when you were a teenager, and it's the first time you heard an album that would change you forever. Whether you're a musician, and it was the reason you picked up an instrument and started a band, or if you're just a music lover, it's the album that made you who you are to this day. You'll tell people that your life wouldn't be the same without it. It changed your DNA. So join me on the podcast where I do deep dives on some of the most influential and important albums in my life. And other times I welcome guests on the show to talk about their musical journeys and what they consider to be their waterproof record. It's time to wax nostalgic with Waterproof Records with Jacob Givens.